What's going on, YouTube? Alright, so this video, I'm going to just tell you straight up at the very beginning, this is going to be a long video, because what we're going to be doing today is showing exactly how to transition from full automatic all the way into manual mode. I've scoured YouTube, I've looked, and one thing that I did notice is there are a lot of videos on the topic. The only problem with those videos is the fact that they don't show what they're talking about. They talk about it. They talk about the shutter speed, the aperture, how it works, what it does, the ISO, sensitivity, but they don't actually take the time to show you the actual feed from the camera so you can visually see what those changes actually make. Now, I'm going to change that with this video. This is probably going to be the only video that you'll find where I actually take the time to show you step by step with the camera exactly what these changes actually do to your image. I'm hoping at the end of this long video, because there is no short way to go about this properly, so think of this as my first course for free? I don't know, whatever you want to call it. But anyway, what I'm hoping is that you do get the information that you need so the transition to manual mode is not so overwhelming and it doesn't destroy your want to do photography. You have to keep in mind, on one hand the video is going to be long, but at the same time, since you're into photography, or you wouldn't be watching this video, photography is a lifelong journey of education and learning. Even the most seasoned professional still learns as they continue to shoot. There's always something new to learn. And that's just the way it is. This is not something where you just, boom, I'm the master. It doesn't work that way. There's various steps all along the way. There's a million different avenues. You start down here, you go all the way up, and you just keep on climbing. So with that said, let's get right to it. We're going to start with the semi-automatic modes, like aperture priority and shutter priority, and I will explain what aperture priority is in layman's terms. Everything's going to be, I'm going to try to keep everything in as much layman's terms as possible, without any scientific jargon or any specific technical information or anything like that. So shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Going to explain those. Actually, let me see if I can do that right now without even having to really think about it. So ISO is the overall sensitivity the camera will have to all the light that's in the scene. Think of it as, in audio, think of it as kind of like a microphone gain or amplifier gain, right? If you crank it up too high, it'll get distorted. If it's too low, there won't be any sound, really, right? Because you're going to be turning the volume down. Somewhere around the middle is ideal, right? You can maybe move up to 75% and it'll still sound pretty crisp. Same principles, actually. Now for shutter speed, that is the length of time you're allowing light to pass through the lens onto the sensor. So again, the ISO is the overall sensitivity the camera will have in regards to the light in the whole picture. The shutter speed is the fraction of seconds you're allowing that light to pass to the sensor. And aperture is basically how much light are you allowing to get through the lens in order to hit the sensor. So they are three totally different things, but they all actually affect the lighting. And since a camera is just basically a light box, and that's all it does is record light, each one of those settings will have an effect on the photo that you're trying to take. Anyway, alright, enough with that whole background thing. Let's just get right to it, show you the back of the camera, and start taking some photos and show you the differences. Blah! Alright, so as you can see, I'm using aperture value or aperture priority mode. This is the back of my Pentax K30 camera. And if you look at the very bottom here, I've got ISO 100 f5.6 for the aperture and shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. Now watch what happens when I change the aperture. f8, f9, you'll notice the shutter speed is changing. As I make the iris of the lens smaller by using a higher f number, it's less light. So the shutter speed actually has to slow down in order to compensate for that. And as you can see, when I increase the size of the iris by using f5.6, the shutter speed went up to 1/500th of a second. So this is basically what it looks like when you actually take a shot, at least in the environment that I was in regards to, slightly blurring the fence, in regards to how the aperture works. Now that is one thing. The aperture does change how much of the entire scene will be in focus as well. It also controls the light, so it is a bit tricky. Now here you'll see at f16, you'll see that the fence is sharper than it was before at f5.6. However, the actual shutter speed had to be decreased. You needed more time for light to be able to hit the sensor because you made the hole smaller for the aperture, so there's less light getting through the lens. So you have to allow more time for that light to actually hit the sensor. That's why you need to slow the shutter speed down. So here I'm changing the ISO. We went from ISO 100 to ISO 320. And we'll go back to 5.6, and you'll notice now the shutter speed is 1/1600th of a second because we've now increased the sensitivity the camera has to all the light available in the scene. So dropping it back to 100, you get a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. So now we're going to go to shutter priority mode. And just give me one sec here. Right now it's at 1/6th of a second. And the aperture is at f40. And if it is blinking, it means that the exposure is beyond the settings that are in the camera right now. So the camera won't even be able to compensate for this, for these settings. And you'll see it's red. Now what would end up happening is the whole scene would be completely and utterly overexposed. Now you'll see as I increase the actual shutter speed, the camera is immediately changing the aperture value. It's actually, as I increase the shutter speed, it's increasing the size of the hole in the lens to allow more light to pass through. And if I change the ISO to make the camera more sensitive across the board, you'll notice that these values change immediately. Now at 6.3, I'm at 1/1000th of a second for the shutter speed. So hopefully this kind of gives you slight bearings in regards to how changing one setting affects the other setting. So at 1/100th of a second, we're now at f20 at ISO 200. It does seem a bit tricky, and that's why I always suggest you start with one of the semi-auto modes, either shutter or aperture value. Pay attention to the settings. Now we'll see at 1/60th of a second what this actually does when you take a photo. And, just in regards to motion blur. Now I'm going to change the shutter speed here. And you'll notice again, the aperture keeps changing as well. Now I'm going to take another shot at 1/500th of a second. And we'll compare the two images back to back. And there we go. All right, so now that is sharp at 1/500th of a second at f9 ISO 200. It's perfectly sharp. It captured the movement perfectly. So there's no motion blur. Now if we go to the other one at 1/60th of a second, you can see it is slightly blurry. The actual motion was not frozen. And that's basically how the shutter speed actually works. You increase the shutter speed in order to freeze motion. Now I'm going to drop this down. I'm going to go to ISO 100, so there's going to be less sensitivity to light. And I'm going to decrease the shutter speed, which again is going to increase the aperture. And here we go. Oh, no, it's focused on the fence. All right, try that again, and boom.
Now you see how absolutely blurred the bird feeder actually is when it's swaying at 1/125th of a second. So, that's basically the control that you have with shutter. Now, this is shutter and aperture priority. On a Pentax camera, it's TAV mode. On pretty much every other brand of camera, Canon, Nikon, Olympus, Panasonic, Sony, it's manual mode with auto ISO. Now you'll see that the ISO was blinking red. That means that the parameters you've set for both the shutter speed and the aperture are beyond what the camera can actually do to get a proper exposure. So you need to either change those settings, lower them down, or speed them up. So faster shutter speed or a higher aperture, and in order to maintain the ISO 100. So here is a shot at what was I doing here? Okay, so I'm going to keep it right at ISO 100. So it's 1/60th of a second at f11, and that's a good exposure. Now the other one was 5.6 at 1/100th of a second at ISO 100, and that was beyond the exposure the camera could do, so it was overexposed. So now we're going to go to manual. So you have to set the ISO yourself. And again, 1/60th of a second, f11 at ISO 100, and you'll see that bar in the center was completely centered. Now we're going to move to ISO, let's see, we'll go to, let's do ISO 800. Yeah, let's do 800. And now you'll see just above the ISO, there's that bar. That is showing that it's actually going to be overexposed, where the plus side is. Dead center is a good even exposure across the board, and I'm only changing the aperture. So with me only changing the aperture, and now I'm changing the shutter speed, you'll see that they both affect the amount of light. And if you actually look at the live view screen, you can see it's increasing and decreasing how bright and dark the shot will actually be. So again, as I change these settings, you'll notice it starts getting darker and darker and darker, and it's on the minus side, so it'll be underexposed. So as I'm changing it back, you'll notice that it starts to actually, now that I'm changing the aperture, it's going dark again, opening up the iris of the lens and changing the shutter speed to a slower amount is increasing the light exponentially. So basically in manual mode, you just want to make sure that that bar is pretty much as close to the center as possible. I always suggest start with aperture mode, shoot with that for a while, shoot with shutter priority mode for a while, but pay attention to the back of your camera so you know specifically what the settings are that the camera is telling you, and that'll give you a good baseline to actually go on. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. All right, so I hope that this video helps you out in regards to a better understanding in regards to the transition from full automatic, semi-automatic to manual, and things to look for that'll guide you. I mean, pretty much everything is built into the camera. You just need to know exactly what you're looking at and how to interpret what the camera is telling you. The three principles, again, to remember is ISO controls the overall sensitivity for all the light that's in the scene, period. And aperture controls the amount of light that's actually going to get into the lens and pass through to the sensor. And the shutter speed is the duration of how long you're allowing that light to actually hit the sensor when you take the picture. Those are the three things. The only caveat is aperture controls both the depth of field, or how far into the photo will be in focus, versus how much of it will be blurred, as well as the amount of light that you're allowing to pass through. So it is a little tricky at the beginning. But again, as I suggest, start with the semi-auto modes and just pay attention to the settings that the camera's picking for certain situations, and eventually you will get there. Me personally, I spent, give or take, 6 months shooting in aperture priority, and then another 6 months shooting in shutter priority. And then when I moved over to manual mode, I knew that like the back of my hand, man. It was like, what? It was like nothing, man. So it can be done. I know it is frustrating to a certain extent. However, just stick with it. And as I said, photography is a lifelong journey of education. It doesn't matter how good you are, there's always something else to learn. So don't despair, just keep plugging away at it. And if you have any questions, leave a comment down below. And you guys will see me on my next video. I'm out.